If you have ever called your boss a manager, or complained about a gloomy day, or even told a friend that someone had swagger, well, you are actually speaking the customized slang of a 16th century theater entrepreneur.
You really are. It is kind of wild to think about.
It is. And today, we are looking at a massive stack of sources, historical biographies, linguistic analyses, literary deep dives, and we are focusing on two absolute titans of English literature, Geoffrey Chaucer and William Shakespeare.
Two very heavy hitters.
Oh, absolutely. And the mission of this deep dive is to figure out how the English language went from being considered this, secondary, unrefined dialect to the absolute peak of literary expression. And it's all because of the distinct ways these two individuals operated.
Yeah, it's a fascinating trajectory. I mean, largely because we take modern English for granted, right? We just assume the vocabulary we use to express complex thoughts or, deep emotions has just always existed.
Like it just fell out of the sky.
Right, exactly. But the sources reveal this centuries-long story of linguistic engineering. Basically, specific people had to forge, shape, and popularize the very words that you're listening to right now.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start in 14th century England, so the Middle Ages. This is long before English was considered a language worthy of anything resembling high art. What was the actual linguistic hierarchy back then?
Well, the landscape was strictly divided by class and power. A lot of this is the legacy of the Norman conquest in 1066. So in the 14th century, if you were dealing with the law or the royal court or diplomacy, the dominant language was French.
Okay, French for the elites.
Right. And if you were dealing with the church or academia or, serious high-end literature, you used Latin.
Wow, okay, where did that leave English?
English, specifically Middle English at the time, was largely just the common tongue. It was the language of the fields, the taverns, the laborers. The educated elite considered it far too crude and structurally unrefined to express nuanced philosophical ideas or like sweeping poetic epics.
I am really trying to wrap my head around this. If Latin and French were the absolute gatekeepers of power and intellect, why would anyone attempting to write serious literature even bother with English? Enter Geoffrey Chaucer.
Yes, enter Chaucer.
Because looking at his biography in our sources, he was not some, rebellious underground peasant writer. He was deeply embedded in the
Oh,
establishment.
very much so. He was a highly successful, lifelong public servant. Chaucer was a courtier, a diplomat who traveled extensively to Italy and France for the crown. He served as a member of parliament.
Wow.
Yeah, and more importantly, he held this incredibly demanding day job. He was the comptroller of customs for the Port of London and later the clerk of the King's Works.
Wait, Clerk of the King's Works, what is that?
He literally organized the maintenance of royal properties like the Tower of London. So he was completely entrenched in royal bureaucracy, international commerce, and the law.
Which makes his choice of language incredibly risky, right? I mean, think about it. If I am a social climbing 14th century government tax official, someone who is policing shipping manifests and rubbing shoulders with French-speaking royals, why would I write my magnum opus in the language of the peasants? It seems like professional suicide.
It does seem crazy. But what's fascinating here is understanding the sheer cross-section of humanity Chaucer dealt with every single day.
Right, because of the day job.
Exactly. As a controller of customs, he wasn't just talking to royals. He was interacting with Italian merchants, French diplomats, rough English sailors, local traders, laborers. He had his ear tuned to the vitality of the English dialects moving through the Port of London.
Ah, he heard the rhythm of it.
He did. He recognized that while French and Latin had all the prestige, English had this raw, energetic rhythm that was incredibly expressive.
But recognizing that energy and actually convincing the elite to read it are two very different things. How do you force an entire establishment to take a street language seriously?
Well, you don't just write in English. You have to prove that English can handle immense structural complexity. So when Chaucer wrote major works, like the Canterbury Tales, he didn't just write simple folk stories.
Right.
He utilized complex verse. He invented new poetic meters. He blended tragedy, philosophy, and, lowbrow comedy altogether. He essentially synthesized the London dialect into something robust enough to be consumed as high art.
That is wild.
Yeah, he demonstrated mechanically that English was capable of sophisticated artistic expression.
Which is exactly why the sources refer to him as the father of English literature. He essentially kicks the door open.
He definitely built the foundation, yeah.
Okay, so Chaucer proves English isn't just tavern talk. He builds the chassis. But, a chassis isn't a race car. You still need an engine, and more importantly, you need fuel. Which brings us to the 16th and 17th centuries, the English Renaissance.
Right, the second figure in our stack of sources.
Yes, William Shakespeare. Now, the question often comes up for people, and I'm sure you listening might be wondering this too, so are Chaucer and Shakespeare both the founders of English literature?
Yeah, that's a common question. But the term founders kind of implies they were doing the exact same job simultaneously, which creates a historically inaccurate picture.
Okay, so how should we frame it?
Based on the linguistic consensus in our sources, a much more accurate way to ask that is, are Shakespeare and Chaucer considered foundational figures in English literature?
Foundational figures. Let's break down that distinction because their roles in the timeline of the language are vastly different.
They really are. Basically, Chaucer is the starting point. He's like the open source developer who built the operating system. He made it possible for English to run literary programs in the first place.
I love that analogy.
Right. But Shakespeare, arriving 2 centuries later, he represents the peak. He built the killer apps that made everyone realize the absolute full potential of the machine.
So what does this all mean? Basically, Chaucer made it possible to write serious literature in English. Shakespeare made it a great one.
That is a very concise way to frame it, yeah. Chaucer legitimized the language, but when Shakespeare arrived, English still lacked the massive processing power, the vocabulary to express, like, really complex human psychology. Shakespeare had to fundamentally expand the language to do what he wanted it to do.
Let's talk about that expansion, because the numbers in these linguistic analyses are staggering. The Oxford English Dictionary credits Shakespeare with the first recorded use of roughly 1,700 words.
1,700, yeah.
But practically speaking, I just have a hard time believing a playwright sat at a desk mathematically inventing 1,700 words from scratch. Did he just assemble random letters until they sounded good?
No. And this raises an important question. The academic consensus is that he did not invent all 1,700 words out of thin air. You have to remember, Shakespeare was living in London during a period of massive cultural collision and growth.
Right, the Renaissance was booming.
Exactly. Many of these words were likely already floating around in the spoken slang of the markets, the pubs, the streets. Shakespeare's specific genius was being the first person to capture those spoken words and inject them into written, highly visible literature.
Wait, pause for a second. The sources say he standardized these words. There were no formal English dictionaries back then. How does a playwright standardize a language just by writing a script?
Through the sheer repetitive mechanics of the Elizabethan theater. Think about how the Globe Theater actually operated. You have actors who have to memorize and repeat these exact words precisely, multiple times a week.
Oh, I see where this is going.
And then you have an audience of thousands, many of whom were completely illiterate, listening to these new words, understanding them through the context of the actors' performances, and then carrying those words back out into the streets of London. It was basically a mass broadcast system.
It is so similar to the mechanics of a massive digital platform today. Like, a modern social media influencer might not invent a specific slang term, right? They might have just heard it in a niche community. But by broadcasting it to millions of followers, they force it into the mainstream lexicon.
There is a definite parallel there, though with a major constraint. Shakespeare wasn't just throwing slang into the ether to see what went viral. He was tightly constrained by poetic structure, specifically iambic pentameter.
Right, the rhythm. Da-dum-da-da-ba-da.
Exactly. The rhythm of his plays demanded words that had specific syllable counts and specific stresses. If the street slang didn't fit the rhythm, he had to alter it.
Which brings up one of the most fascinating mechanisms in the sources, root modification. This wasn't just capturing slang, this was active linguistic hacking.
Root modification was one of his absolute greatest tools. Shakespeare realized you could create entirely new words by simply attaching prefixes and suffixes to existing root words that the audience already understood.
Can you give an example?
Take the word comfort. The Elizabethan audience knew what comfort meant, but Shakespeare needed a word to describe the absence of it, so he attached the prefix and the suffix, able to create uncomfortable.
Wow. So he takes break and makes it breakable. He takes count and makes countless. He takes dress and creates the action to undress. To an audience hearing that for the first time, it must have felt like a magic trick. They recognize the core of the word, but the meaning has been completely inverted or expanded in real time.
It's brilliant because it allowed him to mutate the language to fit his poetic meter, while keeping the audience completely engaged. because they could intuitively guess what the new word meant.
I want to look at the actual lists of words from our sources now because the sociological impact is what elevates this from a history lesson into something deeply relevant to you, the listener. Let's look at the everyday vocabulary he first recorded. Think about how often you say these. Words like bedroom, lonely, manager, fashionable, eventful, generous, gloomy, laughable.
It's amazing. And he also gave us words for darker, more dramatic actions. The word assassination is first recorded in his work. He gave us dishearten, negotiate, and hurry.
Oh, and swagger.
Yes, swagger, used in A Midsummer Night's Dream and King Lear to describe walking with arrogant confidence.
The weird ones are great, too. Like he first recorded eyeball, zany, lackluster, and the concepts of being hot-blooded or cold-blooded. But I really want to focus on the emotional vocabulary. Words like addiction, amazement, excitement, suspicious, obscene, radiance. This is where we hit a massive aha moment for me. Why did English society suddenly need these specific words?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, that maps directly onto the massive societal shift happening during the Renaissance. In the Middle Ages, human existence was largely collective. You were defined by your guild, your parish, your manor, or your social class.
Right, you were part of a group.
Right, but the Renaissance brings about the rise of the individual. People are beginning to focus on the self. Personal ambition, personal doubt, internal psychological states.
Right. So a collective society might not need a nuanced word like lonely because you are rarely isolated from your collective group. But an individualistic society desperately needs a word to describe the specific internal ache of isolation.
Precisely the point. Shakespeare wasn't just expanding the dictionary for the fun of it. He was building a psychological vocabulary because the culture was demanding a way to describe the internal human condition. Before Shakespeare wrote these words down, how did people concisely express the complex dread of being suspicious or the sheer overwhelming joy of amazement?
He literally gave people the linguistic tools to describe their own minds.
He did.
Which is why, by the way, if you are actively learning or trying to master English, leaning into these specific Shakespearean words is incredibly effective. The sources highlight that prioritizing words like lonely, comfortable, hurry, suspicious, and manager allows you to build highly natural conversational fluency. You can say, I felt lonely in a new city, or this chair is very comfortable. You are technically speaking 400-year-old Shakespeare, but you are also speaking perfect, foundational, modern English.
And those words form the bedrock of the language precisely because they perfectly map onto everyday human experience. And this brings us to why Shakespeare represents the absolute peak of English literature. The vocabulary was just the toolkit. The true mastery was what he actually built with those tools on the stage.
Let's compare that to what came before him. If I went to see a play prior to Shakespeare's dominance, what was I actually watching?
In the earlier days of English drama, you were largely watching morality plays or straightforward historical pageants. The plots were focused on very clear-cut themes of good versus evil.
Very black and white.
Exactly. The characters were generally flat archetypes. You had the virtuous hero or the wicked sinner. They didn't have internal contradictions. They just did what the plot required to deliver a moral lesson.
They were two-dimensional.
Right. Shakespeare completely shatters that paradigm. He introduced highly complex, contradictory psychological character studies into mainstream entertainment.
Look at Hamlet. The actual plot of Hamlet, a prince needing to avenge his murdered father, is a standard, pulpy revenge thriller. But the core of the play isn't the ghost or the sword fights.
No, the core is Hamlet's deep, paralyzing psychological hesitation. It is a brilliant study of a man terrified of the consequences of action, who is constantly debating his own reality. Or, take Macbeth. It isn't just a play about a king being killed. It is a meticulous, agonizing exploration of ambition, guilt, and the slow unraveling of a human mind.
Shakespeare held a mirror up to our own messy, contradictory psychology.
Exactly.
And here's where it gets really interesting. I'm so glad you mentioned the pulpy revenge thriller aspect. Because when we talk about the peak of high literature and psychological character studies, it can sound, I don't know, incredibly stuffy. It sounds like required reading in a silent library. But the sources make it very clear that Shakespeare was not some untouchable artist staring pensively out a window. He was deeply pragmatic.
Oh, absolutely. He was a commercial artist operating in a highly competitive market.
He was a businessman. He was a part owner of his playing company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men. He literally helped finance and build the Globe Theatre in 1599. He invested in real estate back in Stratford-upon-Avon. He had overhead, he had actors to pay, and he had to fill that open-air amphitheater every single afternoon.
and filling that theater required a massive, diverse audience. The Globe held up to 3,000 people. You had wealthy nobles sitting up in the expensive covered galleries, and then you had the groundlings.
Ah, the
Yeah,
groundlings.
the working-class laborers, apprentices, and sailors. They were standing shoulder to shoulder in the dirt yard right in front of the stage, completely exposed to the weather.
If you serve up 3 hours of dense philosophical soliloquies to a crowd of groundlings standing in the rain, they're going to throw fruit at you.
They absolutely would. And that necessity, the sheer need to keep 3,000 vastly different people entertained simultaneously, is the catalyst for his genius. Shakespeare mastered the art of merging highbrow psychological complexity with lowbrow, visceral entertainment.
You get Hamlet contemplating the existential nature of death, right alongside bawdy sex jokes, graphic sword fights, and slapstick physical comedy.
He catered to the entire spectrum of society at once. He didn't compromise the artistic depth, but he ensured the delivery mechanism was universally engaging. And because he captured the minds of both the aristocracy and the working class, his work became the undisputed, shared core text of English-speaking culture.
It is an incredible evolution when you look at the whole timeline. We start in the 14th century, with English completely dismissed as an unrefined secondary dialect. Then Geoffrey Chaucer, this overworked government customs official, navigating the politics of a French-speaking court, forces the literary establishment to respect the language of the streets by writing the Canterbury Tales. He builds the operating system.
He proves that the language can sustain serious literary weight.
Right. Then, 2 centuries later, William Shakespeare steps in. A theatrical entrepreneur who hacks the language with root modification officially records 1,700 new words to describe the emerging Renaissance psychology, invents the concept of swagger, and merges profound human complexity with mass entertainment. Chaucer made it possible. Shakespeare made it great.
Is a remarkable progression, and looking at the mechanics of how they did it leaves us with a highly provocative question regarding our own era. Think about the pattern here. Chaucer legitimized, overlooked, everyday language by utilizing it for complex art. Shakespeare expanded the language by adopting the rapid-fire slang and mutations of the London streets and broadcasting it through the mass media of the theater.
So what is the modern equivalent of that mechanism?
Well, as you scroll through the internet today, you are surrounded by constantly evolving text-speak, digital acronyms, viral slang, meme formats. The literary establishment generally dismisses this as the degradation of language, but history suggests otherwise. Are we currently witnessing the messy, everyday foundation of what will eventually become the high literature of the 25th century?
That is a wild thought. Someone right now is taking the chaotic slang of the internet and building the next operating system. Who is the digital Chaucer of today?
It is entirely possible that the foundational texts of the future are currently being typed into a social media app.
That drastically changes how you view your next text message. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures and the words around you. And the next time you use a word like comfortable, lonely, or manager, remember the centuries of linguistic engineering it took to put that word right on the tip of your tongue.